Um, Today's speaker is Rebecca Hale, and she is a senior scientist at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Maryland, a recent appointee there. Rebecca has an interesting and prestigious CV. She, amongst other things, she did a PhD at Arizona with Nancy Grimm, where she started, I guess, her work on urban streams. She did a postdoc in Utah. I think that was at in Utah, and then she was a professor or assistant professor in Idaho at Pocatello. So she's been at many of the best stream places in the US, which is where the best stream ecology in the world takes place, regressively. So she's an ecosystem scientist and particularly interested in nutrient cycling, hydrology, and interactions of streams and people. So urban streams are amongst the probably most abused systems in the world. For generations, we covered them over, we straightened them, we threw supermarket trolleys in them, we used them to dispose of rubbish and dead dogs and goodness knows what. And it's only relatively recently, probably in the last 15 or 20 years, I guess, that people have started to realize that they're repositories for lots of wonderful natural things. They carry out lots of important ecosystem services, and they're being restored all over the world. So it's really great to have an expert on urban streams to talk to us today. So without further ado, I'll introduce Rebecca Hale. Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for coming and attending this talk. And I also want to introduce my fellow presentees here that might be making an appearance. The perils of Zooming from home early in the morning. A couple of guests. So thanks so much for coming. As Alan mentioned, urban streams have often been kind of neglected ecosystems. And today I'm going to talk about some of the approaches that we've been taking and also kind of some historical context for how to think about urban streams. Oh, sweetheart, Mama is getting a tired. Hi. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we don't think of cities as often as being kind of natural places where there is a lot of nature. We think of them often as in opposition to nature. And so, you know, many downtown urban areas, we see, you know, very impervious. Oh my goodness, so sorry.
It's all right, Rebecca. It can take a minute to resolve it.
Life is fun. All right. Downtown urban areas, very impervious. And there aren't really places for water to go, for plants to take root in these places. But urban areas actually have a lot of biodiversity and really rich natural histories. So here I'm just showing kind of a selection of. Oh, this is there you go. Okay, go downstairs, please. Thank goodness for screen. Accidental wetlands. So this is a picture from Phoenix, Arizona. Some wetlands that appear just in places where there are where water was not intended to go, but ended up going there. Spontaneous vegetation. So what we might colloquially call weeds. Showing up anywhere they can find a spot in between the cracks in the pavement. A remnant ecosystem. So this is a picture of a stream near my home in Maryland, actually. So ecosystems that we just didn't develop. So they're just kind of remnant ecosystems that are in the places where we live. And then also green infrastructure. So these can be more intentional green spaces, natural places that we've created in urban areas. And this can be anything from stormwater infrastructure to parks and gardens. And so today I'm going to talk about streams. So this is a really depressing view of a stream ecosystem, courtesy of the United States Geological Survey. And you can see it looks really sad. The water looks gross. It's full of all sorts of nasty things. There's trash in the stream. The riparian area is basically decimated. The banks of the stream are all eroded. It looks like there's some oil spilling into the stream. The biotic component of this ecosystem is usually also kind of limited. So we see lower biodiversity in these systems, a loss of more sensitive taxa, and increases in taxa that are more tolerant, and often increases in invasive species as well. And so I'm going to kind of walk through some of the reasons that these kind of changes happen to our streams. And the first is really that urbanization really dramatically changes watershed hydrology. And so on the left here, we see a cartoon really of how water might move through a natural ecosystem where rainfall, it comes from the sky and it infiltrates into the soils, and much of that evaporates, and only a small percentage of that water is actually running off directly into surface waters. When we urbanize, we put down a lot of impervious surfaces, so rainfall cannot infiltrate into cement or asphalt or your rooftop, and so a lot of that ends up becoming runoff. And so we have increased volumes of runoff in these systems, and also because it's going through over these surface flow pads and not traveling through deeper soil flow pads, we see a flashier, what we call flashier hydrology. So during rain events, discharge increases really rapidly and then also recedes quite rapidly. And these more powerful flows can cause problems like these erosion of stream banks, but they can also scour a lot of the benthic area of the stream as well. And so we see decreases in algal populations following storm events, and also the loss of any kind of coarse organic matter. So sticks and leaves and things like that get scoured downstream. And those really provide the basis of aquatic food webs. And so the loss of those frequently during these storm events really has a strong impact on stream ecosystems. Urban streams also can suffer from warmer temperatures and hypoxia. So these are some data from 3 streams that we were monitoring in Boston, Massachusetts over the last year. And the red and the green ones, Alewife and Beaver, are 2 urban streams, and then Stony Brook, the one in blue, is non-urban. And so this is just showing water temperature, and just for the summer of 2022. And you can see that the urban streams are quite a bit warmer, and these temperatures are getting really high, so well over 25 degrees Celsius during the summer, which is not a place that any cold water fish would want to be, for example. And then this lower plot is showing dissolved oxygen concentrations in these same 3 streams over a full year. And I've put this black line here showing the threshold for hypoxia, so oxygen concentrations that are really incompatible with the ability of fish to breathe. And you can see that for the summer, especially this Alewife brook is going through these daily fluctuations where it's experiencing hypoxia every single day. And that's really, really not a good situation for a lot of aquatic organisms. And so you can see here, this is a photograph of a fish kill that happened in a creek that was experiencing a lot of hypoxia. And this is something that's observed in a lot of urban streams. And then urban water quality, beyond oxygen and temperature, is also quite degraded. So this plot here is showing specific conductivity for those 3 streams. And again, the blue is the one that's not urban. So you can see that conductivity is relatively low. And then in the urban streams, we see especially elevated conductivity during the winter as the result of salting of roads for road safety, which is obviously an admirable goal. But it has this legacy impact where even through the summer, conductivity is quite high. And I've put a line here at 1,500 microsiemens per centimeter, which is generally considered the upper threshold of conductivity for fresh waters. And so we're seeing that during the winter, some of these waters are becoming even brackish, which again is not where freshwater organisms want to be. And so specific conductivity is a really coarse measure of water quality, but we see increases in a large number of pollutants in urban streams. So salts, nutrients, also pesticides and herbicides, pharmaceuticals and personal care products have been found at elevated levels in urban streams, oil and grease from road runoff, and heavy metals. And then recently there was some really interesting work in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, finding that chemicals that were leaching from tires were actually the source of salmon fish kills. And that salmon were really, really sensitive to this chemical that was being added to tires to prevent tire degradation from ozone. But the reaction with ozone actually released this really highly toxic chemical that was just decimating salmon populations. And so that was a really depressing kind of look at urban streams. And so I want to take just kind of a refresh a little bit, reset. Look at this really beautiful urban stream. This is also an urban stream. This is the Jordan River, which flows through Salt Lake City in Utah, which is a place that I'm currently doing some work. And this stream is not, it's not pristine, although you might be confused. You might think it is just looking at this beautiful picture. There are 7 wastewater treatment plants that discharge effluent into this stream. There's certainly plenty of urban stormwater runoff that goes into the stream. But there have been also a lot of efforts to restore the stream, to create these really nice stream banks, and to create opportunities for people to recreate on this stream. And so today I want to kind of talk a little bit about how tremendously diverse urban streams can be. And so it's not just that gross picture from the U.S. Geological Survey, but we see urban streams that look like so many different things, from the Los Angeles River in the US, which is basically just a concrete channel, and really disinvites any kind of human use with it, to places like the San Antonio River Walk, also in the United States and Texas, which is also not a very natural place, but invites a lot of human interaction with the place. There's boats going through here and all these people dining next to the stream. And then other streams that look, very much like natural streams that you would find in the forest. And so one of the questions that I'm really interested in is, why do urban streams look and function the way that they do? Why do we see this tremendous diversity? And it's really all about people. And so I'm going to talk a lot about people and how we do or don't see urban streams and rivers, and how we've kind of treated urban streams through time. And my kind of take home today here is that understanding urban streams really requires understanding how people manage urban watersheds. And so thinking about wastewater and solid waste management, and also stormwater and flood management. And I put this little asterisk here because I'm, as Ellen mentioned, an ecosystem ecologist, which means I really care about the movement of material and energy through ecosystems. And so I'm not going to show a lot of pictures of biota today, but I'm going to talk more about the movement of nutrients and energy. And to kind of give you the punchline now, what I really want everyone to take home today is that urban streams are really shaped by urban watersheds, and that how people manage urban watersheds has changed a lot through time and also over space, and it's continuing to change in ways that I think are really good. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about waste management and the history of waste management, which is really fascinating. So before we had sewers, waste management looked like this. So there wasn't a lot of water in early Western cities. And so any human waste went into cesspools, and that waste was then collected by so-called night soil men, who had the not very pleasant job of collecting all of that and disposing of it. And so some of that waste was sold to farmers. It made a really nice fertilizer. And sometimes it was just dumped directly into the river. As indoor kind of water supply became more available, that created a real problem for this kind of pre-sewer waste management system, because it made the night soil not so soily anymore. It made it much more liquid, and it also increased the volume of that waste. And so that presented a real problem. And that was around when we started seeing, oh, dude, now being attacked by my cat. The emergence of centralized sewers and then eventually wastewater treatment. So this is data from a really cool paper where they looked at the kind of history of waste collection in Paris, France. And this is showing from 1850 to about 2010, the increase in the population of Paris. And then in this dashed line, the population, the number of people for whom waste was actually collected. And so we can see that this started around the 1870s. We started seeing collection of that in these centralized systems. But of course, there was a really large gap between the population whose waste was actually being collected and then the population who was actually creating waste. And so all of that material is potentially ending up in our rivers and streams. Soon after the people started collecting this in centralized systems, we started treating to actually remove some of those materials, and in a lot of cases so that it could be better recycled and those nutrients captured and used for things like agriculture. But again, we see this really large gap between the capacity to treat wastewater and the amount of wastewater that's actually being collected. And so lots and lots of raw sewage going into systems kind of throughout the 1900s. And we see a similar thing in the United States. So this is work I did in the northeastern United States. And so it's the entire Northeast. So it includes urban as well as rural populations. And so we also see over the 1900s an increase in the proportion of the population that's served by sewers. But then also really big changes in how wastewater is being treated. So in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of sewage was raw. So it was collected and then it was just dumped. And then fortunately, we see that really steep decline in the discharge of raw sewage and increases in more advanced treatment technologies that do a better job of retaining nutrients. And so that the effluent that's being discharged into our urban streams and rivers is not completely disgusting. And this has really important implications for nutrient loads. So this is showing basically the effect of sewers in orange and treatment plants in green, the effect of that infrastructure on nitrogen yields from the Northeast. And so we can see that as you sewer the population, that just that collection and kind of piping of that waste to the coast increases nitrogen yields, because otherwise that waste is being recycled within soils. And treatment decreases the effective yields because as we have more advanced treatment, we're removing more and more nutrients from that wastewater. One thing I want you to notice here is that the green bars are never as big as, even as they get bigger, they're never as big as the orange bars here. And so our treatment plants do not remove 100% of nitrogen nor 100% of phosphorus. And so wastewater treatment plants are still often major sources of nutrients and also of organic matter. And so effluent can really have big impacts on stream carbon cycling, which is something that stream ecologists can use as kind of an overall measure of an ecosystem. So this is some work that Sarah Ledford did with her group. She's based at Georgia University, where they did this really cool study where they looked at stream metabolism both above and also below wastewater treatment plants. And so this is showing these lighter bar kind of distributions are stream metabolism above the treatment plant. And so in green, we have gross primary production. So that's primary producers, algae and plants, fixing CO2 into organic carbon. And then the blue, this light blue one, is ecosystem respiration. And so that's the breakdown of organic carbon back into carbon dioxide by those same photoautotrophs as well as any heterotrophic consumers. So we see kind of low levels of respiration and primary production above the treatment plant, But then below, we see big shifts. So a huge increase in primary production and a huge increase in respiration. So respiration is measured as a negative number. So this decrease actually means it's increasing. And so why is that? What the hypothesis here is that the nutrients being exported by treatment plant effluent are stimulating primary production. So you have a high light environment, you're adding all these nutrients. So just as we might add nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizer to our gardens or to agricultural fields to increase primary production, nutrients have the same effect when you add them to fresh waters. And then wastewater contains a lot of organic matter, and that can stimulate ecosystem respiration, as can the kind of nice and super yummy organic matter that's being produced by these primary producers within that stream. And so we've also found that wastewater effluent can really change stream organic matter quality. So this is work that my group's been doing in Salt Lake City, Utah. We've been sampling urban streams all across the Salt Lake Valley. And what I'll show you here is that in the river that drains, this is the Jordan River that drains all those wastewater treatment plants, we see much higher biological, more evidence of in-stream production. So this is a metric that we use to understand whether carbon is more autochthonous. So is it coming from in-stream sources? And we see that it's much higher in the river compared to the tributaries that don't have those wastewater treatment plants contributing to them. And we also see, this is another index that basically tells us about how microbial versus compared to more terrestrially derived organic matter. And we see evidence that the river has much higher microbial organic matter in it than those tributaries. And this makes a lot of sense because human waste arrives to the treatment plant already quite microbially degraded. So thanks to all the lovely gut microbes that we have. And then the wastewater treatment plant processing also involves a lot of microbes. And the quality of organic matter here is really important, again, because organic matter is kind of providing the base of the food web. And so the quality of organic matter influences kind of rates of biogeochemical processes, microbial populations, and so on. And so to summarize quickly, impacts of human wastewater, we see these carry nutrients, organic matter. I didn't talk about this, but there's also a lot of pharmaceuticals and personal care products, either directly or byproducts of those. And all of these have huge implications for ecosystem function, for food webs. They influence biodiversity. A lot of the pharmaceuticals also have huge impacts on animal behavior, which is a really interesting. So I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about stormwater and urban flooding, which is another major way that humans influence urban watersheds. And the way that we've managed urban stormwater has really shifted and expanded through time. So this is a figure from Alison Roy's work, where they really showed that kind of we've gone from thinking about quantity, so dealing with the fact that when it rains, the water doesn't have any place to go, and we don't want it going into our basements. And so a lot of the early stormwater infrastructure was really focused on just moving water outside of the urban area as quickly as possible. But those goals have really expanded through time to include not only quantity, but also recreation, integrating with other elements of urban design, thinking about stormwater quality, making sure that we're not just delivering a bunch of pollutants to our streams, and also things like ecosystem health. And so now a lot of stormwater management looks much different than it did before. So we see use of stormwater wetlands often integrated with things like recreational uses. And I was really interested as a grad student in thinking about how these kind of paradigm shifts play out at a local scale. And so one of the things I did for my dissertation was looking at how urban design changes through time. This was work I was doing in the Phoenix, Arizona metropolitan area. So these are data from Scottsdale, Arizona, where we looked at from 1950s to 2010, how did the use of infrastructure change through time? And so we see the use of pipes, so it's conveyance infrastructure, really more predominant in the early parts of urbanization, and then really kind of peeling off through time. Big increases in the use of retention basins. So in 1970, there was a county regulation passed. Any new developments that were greater than an acre, which was most new development in Arizona, because it's really kind of a lot of the development is by developers, and they do these large developments. That they had to retain, these new developments had to retain up to a 100-year storm, all of it. And so we see the huge spike in these retention basins at that time period. Also these engineered channels. So these are these long linear features that kind of cross the landscape. And then newer development since about the 80s or so really is much more of these natural washes. And so this isn't an infrastructure so much, and really just that local regulations prohibited paving over these ecosystems, even though they don't have water in them most of the time. So more of a recognition that these are ecosystems that should be preserved. And because this is such a sprawling urban landscape, developments kind of stretched northwards in Scottsdale through time. And so this variation in infrastructure use through time yields variation in designs over space. So this is really cool. So we see older developments in the southern part spreading northward to newer developments in the northern part, kind of parallel patterns with the density of retention basins. So we see kind of this middle area of Scottsdale just loaded up with retention basins. And then these really just striking transitions in linear infrastructure from pipes in this older area to then these engineered channels and then these washes in the newer area. And so I was so excited about this when I was a graduate student, because how often do you get these really cool opportunities to really compare watersheds that are drained by different types of infrastructure? And we were really interested in understanding how variation in infrastructure affected yields of nutrients from these urban watersheds. And the quick answer is that they do quite a bit. So this is showing each point here is a storm event. And the red points are from watersheds drained by pipes. The green ones are watersheds drained predominantly by these channels, these engineered channels. And then the blue are those that are drained by retention basins. And so on the x-axis here, we have the storm event rainfall depth. And on the y-axis here, we have the amount of runoff. And so you can see that we have a lot of runoff for the sites that are drained by the pipes, much less, about half, for those drained by the channels, and then an order of magnitude less for these basins that are, these watersheds that are drained by these basins. So this really enormous shift in the hydrology of these systems, because the land cover, I will note, is exactly the same for these. So it's really just this infrastructure has this huge impact. And it has this corresponding impact on nitrogen yields from these as well. So we also see this huge reduction in nitrogen delivery from these watersheds, just because we're retaining water, and so it's and that water is not carrying those nutrients downstream. So we see these shifts, and when I finished my PhD, I never really got to figure out why. Why do we see these big shifts in paradigms at a local scale? What happens? And so I did my postdoc in the University of Utah, and I had an opportunity to kind of do whatever I wanted. And so I was like, I'm going to do chapter 5 of my dissertation. So I looked to the media to understand kind of how changes in stormwater management kind of shifted through time. So I looked through old newspaper articles all the way back to the late 1800s, and looked at how people talked about stormwater and how they talked about flooding. So how did they talk about what the problems were when there was a flood or a stormwater issue, and how did they talk about what they should do about it? What are the solutions? So I did this for 2 time periods. So in the gray bars, we have the first half of the 20th century, so about 1900 to 1945. And then a newer period, so 2004 to 2013, are the bars that are in orange. And so there are different amounts of time, but actually the same number of articles for each of those, because the articles have become more frequent. Media proliferation. And so what I want to show here is that in the early parts of the 20th century, most of the articles, so these are different statements that are kind of problems that people talked about. And then the axis here on the bottom is the proportion of articles that have those kinds of statements. And so most of the articles in the early period talked about damage that flooding caused. So it was damaging private property or public property, that it flooded basements. Basement flooding was a huge problem, and also that it caused erosion and debris flows through the city. And then in the more recent period, we see a real shift in kind of how people talk about these things. We see the emergence of the idea that stormwater and flooding can contaminate streams, that flood control itself, the actual infrastructure that we're using, is damaging ecosystems, and that flooding and stormwater threatens the environment. So a real shift from property damage to environmental damage. And that's a big shift that we see through time here. And then the solutions that people proposed for stormwater also really changed over time. So again, in the earlier period, we see a real push for urban infrastructure, for river management, and this included dredging and widening the river to make more space to hold floodwaters, and this idea that we needed more storm sewers. And at the early and in the 1900, there weren't any storm sewers for the Salt Lake City, and so this period from 1900 to 1945 was when the centralized storm sewer system was developed, and it was really in response to a lot of these flood problems that people had. And then the most common solutions proposed in the newer period, in the more recent period, were maintaining infrastructure. So this is because there are a lot of problems with flooding due to the existing storm sewer system getting clogged with debris. Also, the use of sandbags, that we should be using sandbags to just protect property from flooding. And then I thought this was so interesting that a lot of these news articles said, you know what, flooding is going to keep happening. Everyone just really needs to make sure they have insurance, because you're gonna have this problem. And so really the shift towards kind of, instead of hardening our cities, being more accepting, kind of living with this kind of thinking. And then some newer areas that came up in the more recent time period were an idea that there should be alternative stormwater infrastructure, so not just storm sewers, but things like green infrastructure, that we should engage in modeling to predict and prevent damages, protecting floodplains so that the floodplains can actually provide some resilience to flooding, and public education so that people understand that this is a flood-prone ecosystem. And so we see also this kind of widening and shifting of the solution space in Salt Lake over this century-long time period. So I want to kind of come back to this idea that there are these shifting paradigms and kind of walk through kind of a conceptual diagram of how this might change through time. So we have a new city, people start paving it. There's all these impervious surfaces. We need them for roads, and you want to have an impervious roof on top of your house. And these really can create increased surface runoff, and also probably increase nutrient transport, just because you have that transport vector that's moving nutrients through the system. And that increased surface runoff is going to cause flooding, and people are going to realize this and say, you know what, maybe we should have some centralized storm sewers that can move that water out of the way so that we don't have these problems. And then we also know that cities don't exist in a bubble. These are also influenced by current best practices in urban design and in engineering. And so that's also going to influence what kind of infrastructural solutions people use. So people build those storm sewers, and that increases the hydrological connectivity even more. You have increased runoff, you have more flooding kind of downstream. Oh shoot, maybe this was a terrible idea. What should we do? Maybe we should try retaining some of that water in the landscape. In a lot of cities, this happened around the 70s, when current best practices were really starting to say we should have these retention basins, we should be doing more decentralized infrastructure, and that hugely increases retention. So it decreases the amount of runoff we have coming from these ecosystems. And then more recently, we see this shift to more ecological and sustainable design, which is not necessarily in response to the kind of functioning of the actual ecosystem, but I think is much more related to local regulations and also just a broader paradigm shift in how we think about cities and how we need to how we need to be designing them. And we expect, we didn't measure this in the Arizona study, we didn't measure the washes, that this will kind of lead to a more natural hydrology. And so the take home here is really that urban watershed function and the impact it has on streams changes as we reconceptualize urban design, both the goals that we have for what we want our urban watersheds to do and the tools that we use to meet those goals. And so I want to end in the last few minutes with kind of what I see as the next chapter in urban river and stream ecology, which is the revisioning that's happening in a lot of cities. I know it's happening all across the United States. This is a drawing of a vision for the Port Neuf River, which is the river that flows through Pocatello, Idaho, where I recently lived. And this is the culmination of many years of community meetings, surveys of the community, meetings between city officials and scientists and stakeholders and the Army Corps of Engineers to start thinking about how do we recreate a river where people can interact with it and where it can have a more healthy ecosystem, and also that where it can do things that we like hold floodwaters and things like that.
I tried to stop.
Okay, I'll be done in a few minutes. Okay, I love you. So in Pocatello, this is a really dramatic shift from what currently exists there, which is this concrete channel that was built in the 60s in response to all these huge flood events. And it was actually designed so it could hold, just so much more water than the system has ever seen. But as a result, it has these really high concrete channels. There's fences on top of that so that nobody can get into the stream. It's completely disconnected from the community. And so the idea of reconnecting people with the community is a really big shift here. And this is happening close to where I live now as well. These are plans for the 11th Street Bridge Park, which is on the Anacostia River that goes through Washington, D.C. So there have been years and years of effort to try to clean up the Anacostia River, which is pretty terrible water quality. And now that the water quality is starting to improve, there are all these plans to try to bring people back to the river. And so this includes opportunities for education, for community spaces, and for recreation so that people can actually get out and see their river. In the Baltimore, Maryland area, there are also plans, this sketch from the Reimagine Middle Branch project, which is this enormous effort to kind of reconnect people and create this living shoreline along the inner harbor of Baltimore. And so all these projects have some things in common. They're all about reconnecting people and rivers in cities. A lot of urban rivers have been forgotten. They've been buried, as Ellen mentioned, they've been paved over. And this is really about bringing them back to life and really recognizing the value that they can have for people. They're all about the integration of ecological restoration with economic development and also community development. So the idea is really to kind of uplift communities and ecosystems. A lot of these involve habitat restoration and integrating that with flood and stormwater mitigation measures. So how can we make these systems that actually can work for us when it comes to climate change and the fact that these systems are going to be experiencing more intense flooding and stormwater issues through time. And so this is a really I think a really important shift that we're going through here. And so I'm going to wrap up here. This is a picture of what you've now met, both of my children, but there they are playing in our urban stream that's right down the street from our house. So I want to just kind of end with a few notes. One is that urban streams are really shaped by urban watersheds. And so how we manage urban watersheds shapes what happens within urban streams. And our urban watersheds are shaped by people and our relationships with our urban streams and rivers. And our relationships with urban streams are ever evolving. So they're really shaped by broader ideas about human and nature relationships, and broader ideas about how we want our cities to look and how we want to live in our cities. And I think that the next chapter here is really one of hope. So thank you so much, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Rebecca. That was fantastic. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, all good.
I wonder what it's like trying to give a lunchtime talk and take care of two small children at the same time. So that was a great effort.
It was bad timing. My husband's out of town right now.
Anyway, that was really wonderful, and I recognise many of the problems in the US with similar problems here in the UK, with some important differences. We have several questions coming in. The first of them is from Tessa Kershaw, who wants to ask a very difficult question. In what way do pharmaceuticals in the water affect animal behaviour? I guess that the answer is in many ways. Many of them we don't know about, but anyway, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I will say the answer is in many ways. There are many pharmaceuticals in our waters, and that is way outside of my expertise. I wanted to mention it because I think it's really important, but I can't give you any specifics, and I'm sorry about that. But definitely Google it, because
I may be able to help you out. I read a paper recently about platypuses in urban Melbourne, which because they eat lots of insects and things in the river, they apparently ingest more than the human recommended dose for antidepressants. So if platypuses are not depressed in Australia, it's because they're getting all the antidepressants. But it really is an amazing story of how these pharmaceuticals can go through food webs. Mm-hmm. Let's move on then. Celeste Evans asks, did the use of retention basins drop over time due to them being seen as less desirable, or because later developments were on parcels of land less than the size required provision of retention basins?
That's a really good question. Just a few more minutes. We heard Oh yeah. I don't know why they dropped. The regulation stayed the same through time. I don't know what I don't know about the history in no, sweetheart, stay inside. Okay, you can just do it at the table. Okay. I think some of it might have been that there was a shift to using these channels, but I never was able to get a handle on why, kind of what was driving the use of those channels, those open channels in Scottsdale, and whether that was kind of seen as a replacement of retention basins in some ways, but the regulation is still there.
Okay. Neville Squires asks, I think, a question which must have occurred to many of us. In Britain, our stormwater overflows mix surface water with foul water. Mm-hmm. So that when there's, the theory is that only when there's extreme rainfall and the sewers become overwhelmed, do they push out this mix of raw sewage and stormwater mixed together in rivers. Do you have a similar system in the US, or is your floodwater free of raw sewage?
It depends on where you are in the US. The older areas of the US, absolutely yes. So where I am now, so in DC, all the way up the north through the Northeast, the Midwest, and then also the Pacific Northwest, some cities also have that. The Southeast and the Southwest they have separated storm sewer systems. So some of the newer areas where there's newer development don't have those, but yes, that is a huge problem in the United States, especially in older cities where we have these combined sewer systems. A lot of cities are dealing with this. It's really expensive, of course, to separate, to take a combined system and break it into two, right? And so what a lot of cities are doing is actually they're using a lot of green infrastructure to prevent water from from even getting into that combined sewer system. So they're kind of trying to just prevent stormwater from getting into that combined sewer system through a variety of ways. And that has reduced sewer overflows in a lot of places. So there are regulations that are kind of working, people are working to prevent those overflows from happening as much. They still happen. That more so in some places than others.
Yeah, that's a very familiar story to us. I think one difference is we have so much less space in densely populated area like southern Britain, for example. And the suspicion is that the water companies have not been investing sufficiently, and that even when it's not raining particularly hard, these things are still spewing raw sewage into the rivers. It's huge and a very controversial issue at the moment. And indeed, Sarah Lewin Rose says in the UK, there's a lot of conversation about the pollution of waterways by water companies at the moment, which can be very disheartening. In the meantime, what are your top tips for things that we as private citizens can do to help improve the quality of our waterways?
Ooh, top tips for so I guess things that you can do if you have property, not dumping a whole lot of stuff on your own property is helpful in preventing runoff from leaving your property. So if you have downspouts, disconnecting those into rain gardens so that at least your roof runoff isn't contributing to the larger problem. We have a huge problem with just over salting everything when it's snowy here. That just leads to this. We have horrible salt problems in the colder areas of the United States. And then finding out what kind of the main kind of concerns are in your area and advocating for changes for those.
Thank you. We have a citizens, Gab Ellenberg says, we have a citizen science project this month in London called Outfall Safari, where volunteers are trying to map outfalls on urban streams and their pollution effects. Do you have any comments or advice on doing something like that?
That's really cool. One of the hardest things about doing work in this is that you would think because people put all the infrastructure there, we would have great data on where it is, but it turns out we don't. A lot of times we don't know where things are, and sometimes because they were built a really long time ago. And so I think that's a really, really wonderful effort, and I would, so I commend you. I think that's great. If when you're done, you can come over and do it here. But it might, I don't know if you're working with whatever the relevant water managers are to share those data with the people who manage that system. I think it'd be really interesting to see if your map agrees with the information that they already have. It could be really useful for kind of ground truthing existing spatial data that they might have or not.
In the US, do you have, this is from me really, do you have a separation of authorities that are supposed to manage wastewater and environmental protection authorities who are supposed to check up on the quality of rivers? Is there a sort of interplay between those two, indeed a conflict perhaps?
Yeah, you know, I think it varies a lot from city to city. They're almost always in different departments. The people who are managing wastewater and those who are doing stormwater. There's also often separation between those that are designing stormwater systems and those that are monitoring the stormwater systems to see if they work. And it really depends on the city to what extent people are talking to each other. I've certainly noticed that in very small cities, it's small enough that people kind of have to talk to each other a lot more. And so there's a lot more kind of sharing of resources. And I think that becomes more difficult when cities are bigger, but it's the same kind of problem in academia where you can end up getting so siloed and, you know, the right hand isn't talking to the left. Yeah. I think that's a huge problem in cities, and also just the lack of communication between people who are managing land development and those that are managing water, the water part of that equation. They need to be talking to each other. And most cities need to be better.
Two rather specific questions from John R. and David Irwin. One is, do you see ecosystems come back once they're exposed to daylight. So I guess they mean the ones which are in culverts or encapsulated in pipes. If you re-daylight them, do they remain impaired or do they recover? And the other specific problem is we have a big problem with plasticized wet wipes in the UK, which don't decompose, yet people put them in sewers. Do you have those sort of problems in the US?
Yeah, the wet wipes, definitely. Those are a problem everywhere. People love them and they don't like to read the instructions. And then these people sell the flushable ones that aren't actually flushable. That's definitely a problem. In terms of streams coming back when they're daylighted, it depends on what coming back means. One of the things I think is really hard with urban streams is that it's going to be nearly impossible to get them to a place as if they were, you know, in a pristine forest. Especially in the United States, nothing's been unimpacted by humans for thousands of years, and unimpacted by urbanization, at least for hundreds of years. And so there's, it's really hard to kind of bring them back to some kind of pristine state. And I'm not sure if we necessarily want to either. I think being really intentional about what we want our ecosystems to do and what they can do. We can do restoration in ways that can improve nutrient retention. We can do things in ways that improve aesthetic values of a system. Some really sensitive taxa are never going to be in urban streams. And I think that really just means that there are opportunities to kind of figure out the things that we really want to protect in places that are not impacted by urbanization and make sure that those really sensitive taxa have other places to be, and think intentionally about what we can and want to do in urban streams. If that makes sense.
Right. I'll try and wrap this up in just a minute. There's one or two really quite important questions. Robert Perino, I guess he's in the States, has said Washington, DC and Alexandria, Virginia are building gigantic underwater retention systems for stormwater overflow. Are other cities going in that direction? Is this a desirable answer? And I might add that in London, the Thames Water are building a vast super sewer under the river, which will retain huge amounts of sewage, so that to try and avoid the problem of stormwater overflow sewage into the River Thames. So these big engineering solutions, are they seen as feasible or desirable?
You know, they're certainly happening in lots of cities. And you know, in some places, I think it's seen as just the only option, right? Like, Alan, as you mentioned, in places where there's not a lot of space, sometimes the only space is really underground, under a building. And that's where you can put water. I mean, even in downtown Phoenix, they're doing this. They have massive kind of retention tanks underneath buildings because it is so impervious and you can't put in a green infrastructure. And in the DC area, the storm events we're getting here are just getting bigger and bigger. I mean, this past summer before I moved here, there were so many, like, we had 4 inches of rain and in a day kind of events. And it's really hard to deal with that. Even in a kind of natural system, that's going to cause a flood. Like, floods are natural things. So I don't know. I mean, I think at the end of the day, cities are here because people live here. And so we have to kind of protect life and property kind of first. I think that's fair that that's kind of the priority. I don't know what the impact of that is on kind of downstream systems, but it doesn't seem crazy to me to kind of hold water back somewhere and then release it slowly.
And there's a question about, or a comment really about, from Sam Bentley-Toon about misconnections of sewage systems where people have illegally or simply by mistake connected up their domestic appliances and wastewater directly to the channel, bypassing the sewage system. It's a massive problem. What it has been, and I think still is, a massive problem in the UK. I guess it would be a problem similarly in the US, at least in older areas.
Yeah, you know, I haven't seen huge problems with that. here, but maybe because I haven't been asking those questions. It certainly can happen. I don't think it's, I don't know that that's a huge problem. Oh yeah. But then failing infrastructure is a huge problem, especially in older cities where, you know, we still have, no, you can just do it downstairs. Yeah, leaking infrastructure is a really big problem, especially in older cities in the United States. There's been a lot of documentation of that in the Baltimore area, especially where there's been so much stream sampling. But yes, that's a big problem. It's gross.
Well, I think I better let you go, Rebecca, so you can go and tend to your brood. And it's been a really wonderful seminar, and lots of interesting differences and similarities with systems here, and I'm sure in other areas of Europe and other areas of the world. But it's been a fascinating talk, and it's great to see this work going on. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for having me, and thanks so much for all the wonderful questions. It's really great to have so many great, thoughtful questions.